In this video, I'm going to show you 3 different ways to finish off your neckline. Here I'm going to cut out 3 different samples of necklines to use. So I'm going to cut out one scoop neck with a non-stretch fabric, I'm going to cut out a scoop neck with a stretch fabric, and then I'm going to cut out a V-neck again with a non-stretch. I'm going to use these 3 as examples of how to use the 3 techniques that I'm about to show you. The first example we're going to do is the scoop neckline with the stretch fabric. This would be most similar to the basic t-shirt. We're going to need scissors, pins, thread, measuring tape, and then your stretch fabric. We're going to start by measuring out the circumference of the neckline using our measuring tape. I like to mark a little notch, which I'm considering to be the back of the shirt. You're then going to add 2 centimeters to that measurement. Then using the same stretch fabric, we're going to cut a strip in the length that we just measured. The width of this piece is up to you, and it will determine the thickness of the neckline. And keep in mind you're going to need 2 centimeters seam allowance for the width as well. Then you're just going to cut out this strip. With the piece now cut out, you're going to fold it in half, right sides together, and sew the ends with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. You can then trim away any of the excess seam allowance. Then you're going to fold this piece in half, making sure that you're tucking in your raw edges. And we're now ready to attach it to the neckline. So we're going to place it right sides together and pin it all along the opening, again making sure that the piece is folded in half, so you're pinning together 3 layers of fabric. Because of the stretch in the fabric, we're going to use a zigzag stitch. So you can just sew along where you pinned, again using a zigzag stitch. And then if you want to, you can trim away the excess seam allowance. You can either finish here, or you can do one more step of doing a top stitch around the back of the neckline. This will be from the shoulder seam to the shoulder seam on the back of the t-shirt. When you're doing it, you want to make sure that you're catching the seam allowance in your top stitch. This just helps keep everything in place, but it's not entirely necessary. And as you can see, this one is done with a straight stitch. So that's all the steps for this technique of the scoop neckline when using a stretch fabric. Next, we're going to do the example for a scoop neck with no stretch. And we're going to need scissors, pins, elastic, I used a picot elastic, thread, measuring tape, and then our neckline. As you can see, it's tricky just to fold the fabric over to hem it, so we're actually going to do it with a piece of elastic. So placing the elastic on the right side of the fabric, we're going to pin it all along the neckline. If your elastic has a detail like mine, you want it facing away from the edge. And then you're going to sew along where you pinned with a zigzag stitch. At the end, I'm just going to overlap by about 1 centimeter the 2 layers of elastic and then cut away the excess. The next step is to fold this piece of elastic over, and then you're going to do a second stitch. Fold it over, pin it down, and then do a top stitch, again using the zigzag stitch. And that's the last step for our second technique. The third technique is going to be with the V-neck neckline. We're going to need scissors, pins, thread, measuring tape, and some more fabric. So the first step here is we're going to create a facing. And we're going to do this by tracing out the front and the back neckline in 2 different pieces. And make sure you're including seam allowance at the shoulder seams. So I'm just going to cut along the existing neckline and the shoulder seams, again leaving 1 centimeter seam allowance, and then I'm going to make my piece about 5 centimeters in width. The width is up to you, and it sort of depends on the fabric you're using. So you now have the front of the neckline cut out, and then you're going to do the exact same for the back. You want to make sure that the shoulder seams are going to line up and be the same width, so you can use your other piece as a guide. So placing right sides together of your 2 pieces of facing, you're just going to pin it at the shoulder seams. And then you're going to sew where you pinned with a straight stitch. Now with the facing sewn, you're ready to attach it to the neckline. You're going to place the facing and the neckline right sides together, lining up the shoulder seams. You're going to place pins and then sew along with a 1 centimeter seam allowance on the inside of the neckline. When sewing the sharp edge of the V, it helps to lift up the presser foot, twist your fabric around, and then continue sewing. Then you're going to cut a little notch in the V, making sure not to cut the thread, and this will help create a crisper corner. You can cut notches in the other curves as well if you're afraid it's going to pucker. And then you're going to fold the facing on the inside of the shirt. It's really important for this technique that we iron it after we flip it over. So we want to move this now to our ironing board and make sure that we iron it nice and flat. And we don't want any of the facing poking through to the front of the shirt. The last step is another optional step, and it's just to do a top stitch on the facing to lock in that seam allowance, and this will help keep your facing in place. So you want to do this stitch on the right side of the facing, again making sure that you're locking in that seam allowance. This is an optional step, but it's good if you find that your facing isn't staying in place. And now you're all done the third neckline technique. I really hope you guys can use these techniques in some of your next projects. Thank you so much for watching, and if you liked this video, please subscribe.